Welcome to Boring Topics. I had originally planned to start this video with the release of OS/2 and the PS2 line of computers in 1987, which represented the culmination of IBM's effort to take back control of the market from the compatibles that were destroying their market share. However, since an understanding of the rise of the clone market is critical to understanding why IBM made the decisions it did with the PS2 line and the development of OS/2, I realized that another video was needed that covered the rise of IBM compatible clones and their domination of the PC market. So this video will take us through the rise of the IBM compatible market up to 1987, and the next video will start with the PS2 and OS/2 development and reception. IBM's success with the original IBM PC and its AT and XT successors had created the first true 16-bit standard for personal computers. Although not the first or even the most powerful personal computer on the market, the IBM 5150 PC had brought the IBM reputation for quality and reliability to the mainstream personal computer market and led the wave of personal computing out of the 8-bit and into the 16-bit era and broad mainstream acceptance. In 1983, IBM had sold 538,000 PCs. A year later, that number ballooned to 1,375,000, and by 1984, IBM controlled about 50% of the entire personal computer market, a market which still included relatively heavy hitters such as Apple, Commodore, and Atari. But by 1987, cloners such as Compaq and Dell were aggressively attacking IBM's market share, offering systems with increased features and specs while still undercutting IBM on price. IBM was losing its grip on the standard it had created, and they decided that a radical step was needed to regain control of the market. This step was taken in 1987 with the launch of the PS2 line of computers, together with a brand new hardware architecture called microchannel that replaced the existing ISA architecture, was generally incompatible with the previous architecture, and most importantly was legally locked down every single way IBM's lawyers could think of. But how did this come to pass? How did IBM go from on top of the PC world in the mid-1980s to being blindsided by the success of the cloners, a success that was never anticipated by IBM's leaders? Why did they not foresee a potential problem with companies copying the PC and bringing out compatible clones for less money? To answer this question, we have to step back to shortly after the IBM PC 5150 was originally launched. Some of this will expand on stuff I covered in part 1 of this series, so if you haven't watched that video yet, go on over and check it out. As a quick recap, the original IBM PC had been brought to market in 1981 in a remarkably short amount of time, especially considering IBM's usual glacial pace of product development. To do this, they had used off-the-shelf parts for more than 80% of the hardware, paired with an open architecture. IBM's PC division was initially the smallest of the many powerful IBM business divisions, and IBM's corporate management did not foresee it ever growing large enough in size to warrant a fully proprietary system of hardware. A success, yes, but not one that absolutely dominated the PC market. IBM also had purchased their operating system from Microsoft, whose youthful chairman was happy to provide IBM with what they needed at the price they wanted. Something that would become important later was the fact that IBM had gotten their operating system but hadn't seen it as important to lock it down with an exclusive contract. Essentially, IBM's PC was generic in both its hardware and operating system. Microsoft still owned what IBM called PC-DOS, but eventually became known as MS-DOS or Microsoft DOS, and they were free to offer it to any company that would pay the licensing fees. IBM didn't foresee this ever becoming an issue, as why would anybody buy a computer with MS-DOS on it that wasn't made by IBM? Such a computer would be incompatible with software written for the IBM PC, and would thus pose little to no threat to IBM's grip on the market. In order for a cloner to successfully challenge IBM's dominance, they would have the daunting task of creating a product that was not only as good or better as the IBM PC, but also sold for less money and was fully compatible with the IBM PC and its vast and rapidly increasing base of software. It wasn't enough to just run MS-DOS. The competing system had to be fully compatible with the IBM standard in both hardware and software. By 1983, the PC had been on the market for 2 years and was clearly turning into a runaway success. IBM remained convinced that there still existed no real danger of any cloners entering their market in any force. One might ask, why couldn't somebody just buy the same parts as IBM, license MS-DOS from Microsoft, throw it all together, and start selling it? Well, IBM's secret weapon was their proprietary BIOS, a small chip on the motherboard without which no clone could be fully compatible. As of 1983, their BIOS had so far defeated defeated any attempt to copy it, and IBM essentially still had the 16-bit MS-DOS standard to itself. An entire industry had sprung up around this standard, which not only provided software for it, but also provided various hardware plug-in and add-ons for the hardware platform. Everything from early smart home plug-in boards to expansion cards that hooked into sensors and gave personalized weather information for one's property. For the first time, a standard had been created that was forcing the market to coalesce around it. It's hard to picture it today, but in the early 80s there were a plethora of incompatible systems proliferating. Most ran some version of DOS or CP/M, but even if the operating system was the same as a competitor, that didn't mean programs were compatible. It would be like buying a Dell computer to replace your HP. Both of which ran Windows 10, but neither of which was compatible with the other, and software applications had to be customized for each one. In the early 1980s, this was exactly the way the personal computer industry functioned. Outside of the IBM family, there really was no standard for any family of computers. And with no set standard for a computing platform, the market was incredibly fragmented. Even successor systems from the same company were not guaranteed to be backwards compatible with their predecessors. Commodore's VIC-20 was released the same year as the original IBM PC, 1981, to fairly wide success, and 2 years later Commodore followed it up with the immensely successful Commodore 64, which was largely incompatible with the VIC-20's software, although the C64 did retain compatibility with most VIC-20 hardware add-ons like floppy disk drives. But the arrival of the IBM 16-bit standard heralded a change to all of this, a seismic shift that started strong and just kept on building. The IBM 16-bit standard quickly became the standard that was growing the fastest, had the largest base of systems, and most importantly was where the money was. Sure, there were still plenty of Commodore, Apple, and Atari computers around, Radio Shack was even still selling a few TRS-80s, and CP/M machines were still periodically found. The market was large and growing rapidly, and still had many systems of varying compatibility, but the IBM 16-bit standard was where the growth was exponentially occurring, a fact that became increasingly evident as the 1980s progressed. With the notable exception of Apple, most of the other computer companies who were not selling IBM compatibles or developing for the platform would not survive the next 10 years. By 1983, it was clear that the personal computer market's rising, dominant standard was the IBM one, and a software developer or hardware maker's best chance of success was to be compatible with it. This quest consumed early would-be cloners, with Bytes' February 1984's issue saying that the drive to be compatible with the IBM personal computer family has assumed near-fetish proportions. Partially compatible, or even 99% compatible, wouldn't be enough. You had to be fully compatible with the IBM standard, or consumers wouldn't be interested in buying your product. This was a painful lesson that Sanyo learned with its MBC 550, Tandy learned with its TRS-80 2000, and Wang learned with its PC. All of these machines ran MS-DOS and were compatible to some degree with IBM standard, but all failed because they weren't 100% compatible. This only served to increase IBM's confidence in the impregnability of its BIOS and its control of the PC market. IBM actually had logical reasons for their confidence, as from both a hardware and software perspective there were several seemingly insurmountable obstacles for a would-be cloner to overcome. First of all was the actual PC hardware that they used. Although it was essentially available off the shelf to everybody, a would-be cloner would have a difficult time getting the same price as IBM, whose massive size gave it considerable pricing leverage with suppliers. There was a vast difference between the pricing a startup would get on components versus the price one of the world's largest companies would get. And IBM also had its own factories making many of the components that went into the PC, allowing it to be its own supplier in many cases. How could a would-be cloner get components cheap enough to undercut IBM, who not only made enormous volume purchases, they once tried to buy up all the available 286 chips on the market just so nobody else could get them, a decision that would eventually cost them dearly, but also made many of their own components, thus cutting out the middleman entirely. From a software perspective, although the operating system for the PC was from Microsoft, IBM's BIOS, or Basic Input-Output System, was the real key to full compatibility. The BIOS is not an operating system. It is a bootloader that also contains a large number of routines that the operating system and programs running under it could call for operations such as printing, reading user input through the keyboard, and managing access to the floppy or hard disk drive, among many others. From Accidental Empires, the Basic Input-Output System was special computer code that linked the generic operating system to specific hardware. The BIOS was kept very busy while DOS was running, handling constant software interrupts caused by various programs. These programs called a variety of functions built into the BIOS, and expected the BIOS to be there. If those functions weren't there, the program wouldn't run. Upon startup, the BIOS would perform a routine called POST, or Power On Self-Test, where it listened to the peripherals, checked the memory for errors, made sure the hardware was ready, and checked to see which display adapter was installed. On original IBM PCs or compatibles, you usually see the RAM count up to 640K, the usual amount of RAM for an early PC, typically based on the original 4.77 MHz 8088 processor. If you ran a Windows computer up until the late 2000s, you saw a BIOS startup screen every time your computer powered on, usually white text against a black background. Sometimes the BIOS detected a failure in your system and then presented you a cryptic error code and perhaps a monotonous beep telling you that there was a problem that prevented your computer from fully starting up. Otherwise, if the POST was passed, the BIOS then booted the actual operating system. On original PCs, this was invariably Microsoft's DOS. Although Microsoft would happily port MS-DOS to almost any hardware platform, true IBM compatibility required that MS-DOS be linked to the specific hardware by IBM's BIOS. To do otherwise meant no guarantee of compatibility with programs written for the IBM PC, programs that, as previously mentioned, expected certain BIOS functions to be available. If a would-be cloner put out a system that ran MS-DOS but was incompatible with the installed base of IBM PC software, the market would reject it. A legal clone of the IBM BIOS was absolutely critical for a cloner to have some chance of success, a very difficult task at best, and one that IBM felt was impossible. A legal precedent had been established that while the function of code could not be copyrighted, the actual lines of code that created the function could be. The BIOS in an IBM PC was therefore protected by law from any attempt to simply copy it byte for byte. On original IBM 5150 PCs, the BIOS came in the form of an 8KB ROM chip in slot U33 on the motherboard. This chip contained all the BIOS code that IBM had written. Knowing its importance in protecting them from competition, IBM had no intention of selling this chip or its contents to any other company. Since full IBM compatibility required the BIOS chip to be present to link MS-DOS to the hardware, and IBM wasn't selling it, any attempt to clone the IBM PC seemed doomed to failure. Simply having a copy of MS-DOS wasn't enough. The cloners needed the functions contained in the BIOS chip, or they would be in the same situation as the previously mentioned failed systems from Tandy, Wang, and Sanyo. As an example, if the popular program Lotus 123 failed to run correctly, the business market would be completely uninterested in the compatible. For this reason, successfully running Lotus 123 was one of the main tests used when testing a computer's claim to be IBM compatible. With their hardware margins protected by their size and ordering power, their software protected by their proprietary BIOS, and every line of the code in the BIOS protected by IBM's formidable legal muscle, how could a cloner ever manage to even make a 100% compatible clone of the PC, let alone sell it for less than IBM? Well, the cloners were able to do this thanks to the work of 3 startups, including one that almost went bankrupt before it got off the ground. Let's start with the BIOS. In order for the BIOS to be legally cloned, the finished product had to not only work exactly the same as the original BIOS, but do so using entirely different code. This could only be done by reverse engineering the BIOS's functions, or treating the BIOS as a sort of black box where inputs went in, the outputs produced were examined, and a way of producing the same outputs was arrived at by trial and error. This was an incredibly difficult task, one that had never been done before at this level of complexity. To stand up in court, it had to be legally provable that no engineers involved in coding the recreated BIOS had ever even looked at the code for IBM's BIOS. The engineers had to produce a completely original work that performed exactly the same function as IBM's BIOS chip, but was completely different code-wise. IBM didn't think it could be done, and had even published the full specifications for their BIOS under the impression that doing so would make it even more impossible for this legal standard to be met. Their confidence was only bolstered by successful lawsuits against computer makers Corona, Eagle, and Handwell, companies that attempted to produce compatibles by simply copying the bytes in IBM's BIOS. But by 1984, not one but 2 companies succeeded in making a fully legal replacement for the BIOS, although each then proceeded to use it differently. The 2 companies that performed this incredibly difficult reverse engineering feat? Compaq and Phoenix Technologies. Compaq was started in 1981 by Rod Canyon, Jim Harris, and Bill Murto. After rejecting a business plan that called for building hard drives, another one that involved opening a Mexican restaurant, and a third one for building a beeping gizmo that could be used to find lost car keys, they decided to instead clone the IBM PC. They recognized the huge advantages in creating a computer that already had a large base of software, but it would have to have ironclad, legal proof, full compatibility with the IBM PC. Compaq spent $1 million on 15 programmers who worked for months, laboriously reverse engineering the IBM BIOS through extensive trial and error. Finally, they succeeded in making a fully legal copy that performed exactly the same, but used entirely different code. Their first product was profiled in the January 1983 edition of Byte, which opened with words that signaled the start of IBM's long decline as the PC market leader. What emulates an IBM personal computer, can easily be carried from place to place, and costs a lot less than the competition? Compaq's new computer profile was simply called the Compaq, and was a fully 100% compatible clone of the original IBM PC right down to the BIOS. It even accepted the same hardware expansion boards. All IBM software ran without issue on it, and it only cost $2,995 as compared to $3,735 for a similarly equipped IBM PC. Compaq's success in 1983 also dropped more than $10 million into Microsoft's pocket thanks to licensing fees for MS-DOS, a precursor of what was about to come. Surprisingly, according to Paul Carroll's excellent book on IBM was so sure it understood the technology that it didn't buy a single Compaq system to see whether there was anything to be learned from it. This was an attitude that was going to cause problems for IBM not too far down the road. Compaq had worked hard to produce a computer that sold at retail for $800 less than the IBM PC. To sweeten the deal for dealers, they also sold it to them for a 36% discount instead of IBM's 33% discount. And as a final crafty move, they hired Sparky Sparks away from IBM to build their dealer network. Sparks was a good choice for this role, given the fact that he was the man who had built IBM's own dealer network. The end result of this was first-year sales of $111 million with 53,000 computers sold. Compaq didn't rest on its successes, but continued to innovate and develop new systems, with their flagship being the Desk Pro systems, released in 1984, only a year after the original Compaq launched. In 1985, they released the Desk Pro 286 with a more powerful 286 processor that replaced the original Desk Pro's 8088, and in 1987 they beat IBM's first 386-based system to market by 7 months with their own 386-based system, the descriptively named Desk Pro 386. Compaq's computers were faster and had better graphics than IBM's offerings, yet sold for less money. They were the most successful of the cloners, with InfoWorld in 1989 even stating, "Compaq is already IBM's equal in being seen as a safe bet." Compaq's success in reverse engineering the IBM BIOS was significant because they were the first to successfully perform this feat legally. Their success started the stream of revenue pouring into Microsoft's coffers from MS-DOS licensing fees, a stream that would only increase in size and scope as others, inspired by Compaq's success, worked on their own clones. One of Microsoft's marketing managers, Jeff Rakes, put it this way: "With the Compaq computer, we saw the real power of IBM compatibility. Everybody else had been building computers saying we are different from the rest. Compaq came out and said we are not different. We can run any software right off the shelf written for an IBM compatible computer." That was the beginning of PC compatibility. Seeing the massive opportunity and potentially millions of new IBM compatibles entering the market, Microsoft ceased customizing MS-DOS for each buyer and instead only sold the IBM compatible version of DOS to every would-be cloner at pricing typically above what IBM paid, one of the only areas in which IBM came out ahead of the cloners on a deal. But Compaq was just one company. Even with it essentially creating the IBM compatible market in 1983, it was still dwarfed by IBM's size so long as it was the only competitor IBM faced. IBM's PC division reported revenues in 1984 of $4 billion, a number so large that if IBM's PC division was its own company, it would have been the 74th largest industrial company in the country. With 10,000 employees, it was the third largest computer manufacturer, behind only the rest of IBM and DEC, and its sales had grown faster than any other companies in history. In 1984, IBM had reached the apex of its power in the personal computer market. Apple's famous 1984 ad for the upcoming Macintosh computer was squarely aimed at IBM, portraying it as an Orwellian ruler of the PC world with massive control over everybody in it. 1984 was the last time IBM stood so strong. They were about to come under assault by a giant wave of clones that were about to aggressively attack IBM on all fronts. But that was still in the future. In 1984, would-be cloners still faced a difficult task, as even knowing that it was possible to legally clone the IBM BIOS, it was still just as difficult to actually do it. Compaq had spent $1 million and used 15 engineers on the task. This was money and staff that few startups had access to, but this was all about to change thanks to a company called Phoenix Technologies. Phoenix Technologies had been founded in 1979 and originally mostly focused on porting a DOS-based operating system called 86DOS to various hardware platforms. This kept the doors open, but hardly brought in large amounts of money, and the company remained quite small for years. That all changed in May of 1984 when they reverse engineered a fully legal clone of IBM's BIOS. They did this in a very clever way to make absolutely sure that IBM had no grounds to sue them. In place of Compaq's 15 programmers, they hired only a single programmer to do the actual code for their BIOS clone. This programmer had only worked on the Texas Instruments TI-9900 processor before and had never done anything with the Intel-developed processors that IBM used, which had few points of commonality with the TI-9900. For example, the TI-9900 didn't even have a system of interrupts that software could call. Phoenix Technologies then created a group that examined IBM's actual published specifications for the way the BIOS chip functioned, and then wrote specifications that described how the BIOS functioned, but without including any code. These specifications were then passed to the programmer in the form of memos, who then wrote code that tried to conform to those specifications and produce the correct output for a given input. The group then examined the results, noted all the problems, and wrote another memo with a description of the problems encountered, remaining very careful to avoid giving any hint of what code was needed to fix the issue. The end result of many rounds back and forth of this was a fully compatible BIOS clone, backed by a lengthy chain of memos showing that its functions had been duplicated through careful trial and error by a programmer who had no previous knowledge of IBM's hardware or software. Phoenix Technologies had no interest in making IBM compatibles themselves. They instead announced that their BIOS clone was available for license to anybody who could come up with a mere $290,000 or as low as $25 per computer. For those concerned about possible IBM legal action against purchasers of their cloned BIOS, Phoenix Technologies took out a $2 million insurance policy with the Hartford Financial Services Group that would cover the cost of any lawsuits filed. With this reassurance in hand, many companies eagerly paid the licensing fee, making Phoenix Technologies millions of dollars as the compatible market exploded in size. Says Robert Cringely, buying Phoenix's ROM BIOS for $25 per chip, a couple guys in a warehouse in New Jersey could put together systems that looked and ran just like IBM PCs, but cost 30% less to buy. But what about the hardware in the IBM PC? How could a cloner actually get the hardware for less money than IBM was able to? In 1985, Chips and Technologies was still a small startup that was quickly running out of money and was being financed almost exclusively by its founder's credit card. By this point, IBM had brought out a major new version of the PC, the AT, which replaced the old 8088 processor in the original PC with a much faster 286 processor, and among other things allowed for up to 16 megabytes of memory instead of the original PC's 640K. It was selling really well, better than the original PC even, but the IBM compatible market, which was mostly dominated by Compaq at this point, was about to burst wide open. Chips and Technologies had been founded by Intel's former head of marketing, Gordon Campbell, and focused on making general-purpose computer chips. Founded with just $3 million in capital, they set the nascent clone market afire when they brought a set of 5 chips to market in 1985. These 5 chips retailed for $72.40 and replaced a whopping 63 smaller chips on the IBM PC AT motherboard. Chips and Technologies hadn't the slightest intention of using these chips to make their own computers. They instead sold them to any would-be cloner that came knocking. With these chips, plus 19 more easily available chips from one of many component manufacturers, a clone maker could make a 100% hardware-compatible IBM PC AT clone for far less money than IBM was able to. Compaq's successful reverse engineering of the BIOS and aggressive pricing for systems that frequently offered better performance and features than IBM systems had started the process of putting IBM on the defensive, but it was the wave of clone compatibles that hit the market thanks to Chips and Technologies and Phoenix Technologies' affordable licensing agreements that truly unleashed the potential of the IBM compatible market. A good example of what was unleashed was a young college dropout named Michael who had started running a little company called PCs Limited out of his Texas dorm room. He had been very successful in buying gray market IBM machines, upgrading them with new components, and reselling them for a nice markup. But when he saw an ad for the Chips and Technologies chipset, he immediately started work on his own IBM compatible, looking to bring it to market as fast as possible. In his account of this event, Michael says, "I got the names of 6 or 7 engineers and groups of engineers who worked as teams. I called them up and explained that I wanted them to design a PC. One engineer, Jay Bell, replied, 'I can do it in about a week and a half for $2,000. This machine was brought to market in 1985, and it led the way for the company that eventually became known as Dell to $60 million in sales by the end of 1986. The market was wide open, and competing compatibles with a dizzying array of features married with full IBM compatibility began to multiply like rabbits. The computer magazines got ever thicker as advertisements for IBM clones poured in. As just one example of what was touched off, from 1985 to 1986, IBM's share of the highly lucrative business market for personal personal computers fell from 70% to below 40%. To IBM, it started to seem like kids were quitting running lemonade stands for pocket money and instead were hawking their own IBM Compatibles from every corner stand. Between the cloners and Microsoft happily selling MS-DOS to all and sundry, IBM's market was slipping away, and it was being relegated to being just another PC-compatible manufacturer, albeit one with higher costs and far slower R&D processes than its competitors. IBM-compatible manufacturers such as Compaq, Dell, AST, and Leading Edge were far leaner operations than IBM was, with such lower operating costs and faster processes that in 1992, according to one source, after years of aggressive cost-cutting, the IBM cost disadvantage is still about $200 to $1,000 per PC. But that was still in the future, and in the mid-1980s, faced with the massive success of the cloners, IBM got to work on a 1-2 punch that would land in 1987. The first punch was a new generation of IBM computers called the Personal System 2, or PS2, and the second punch was a new operating system called OS2. If IBM succeeded, the entire clone industry would not only drastically diminish in size, but the only ones left would be competing in areas that IBM felt no desire to compete in, with products that IBM received a healthy licensing fee from. IBM's own line of computers would once again be essentially unchallenged in the marketplace, which was enormous compared to where it had been just 6 years earlier when the original PC was released. And even better, Microsoft would be minimized to at best a junior development partner for OS2, the operating system that IBM would own and control, not license from Microsoft. IBM was confident that the market would follow them to a brand new hardware standard, this one almost entirely proprietary, with every part tightly locked down by ironclad patents. Additionally, they looked to bring the operating system standard firmly under their control with OS2. Microsoft's nascent Windows would be relegated to obscurity, and OS2 would deliver a massive stream of revenue into IBM's pockets, while cutting off Microsoft's stream of revenue from licensing DOS to cloners, who could no longer build IBM-compatible systems and thus would go out of business. Between the PS2 hardware and the OS2 software, IBM was positive that they would end the 80s back in control of the market and the standard that they had created. So, where did it all go wrong? We will cover what happened in the next video, tentatively titled, The Cloners Strike Back. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and consider subscribing.